The rain had been falling for hours, the kind that didn't just soak the streets but seemed to seep into people's bones, carrying with it a quiet heaviness that no umbrella could shield. She stood under the flickering streetlight outside a small cafe, her fingers wrapped tightly around a paper cup that had long gone cold, as if holding on to it could somehow steady the storm inside her. Her son slept in the back seat of her aging car, parked just across the road, unaware of the silent battles his mother fought every single day. And in that moment, as cars passed without noticing her, she whispered something she had come to believe was an undeniable truth. Men don't like single moms. If you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel The Emotional Stories, because stories like this remind us that hope can appear in the most unexpected ways. Her name was Alina, and life had not unfolded the way she once dreamed. There had been a time when she believed in forever, in promises whispered under soft lights, and futures painted with laughter. But reality had a cruel way of rewriting those dreams. The man she once trusted had walked away the moment responsibility knocked at the door, leaving her with a newborn and a heart that felt permanently cracked. Since then, every step she took felt heavier, every decision weighed down by the quiet fear of failing the one person who depended on her the most, her son, Daniel. Days blurred into nights filled with exhaustion. She worked long shifts at a small retail store, earning just enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. Every morning she would wake up before sunrise, preparing Daniel's breakfast while fighting the fatigue that clung to her like a shadow. There were moments when she looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The spark in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a constant calculation of what needed to be sacrificed next. The world around her didn't make it easier. People had a way of looking at her either with pity or judgment, as if her story was something to be whispered about rather than understood. Invitations grew fewer, friendships faded, and slowly her world shrank to just two people, herself and her son. It wasn't that she didn't want more, it was that she no longer believed she deserved it. And then there was the idea of love, something that now felt distant and almost unrealistic. Every time someone suggested she should try again, she would force a small smile and brush it off. Deep down, she had convinced herself that no man would willingly step into a life that came with so much responsibility, so much baggage. The fear of rejection was no longer sharp. It had become a dull, constant presence she had learned to live with. That rainy evening, however, something shifted. She had gone to the cafe not for comfort, but simply because she needed a moment away from everything. Daniel had finally fallen asleep after a restless day, and she couldn't bear to sit in the silence of her apartment any longer. The cafe was nearly empty, filled only with the soft hum of distant conversations and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows. That was where she first noticed him. He wasn't extraordinary in a way that demanded attention, but there was something about him that made her pause. He sat alone at a corner table, a book open in front of him, his expression calm yet thoughtful. He seemed untouched by the chaos of the world outside, as if he carried his own quiet sense of peace. Their eyes met briefly when she entered, and he offered a small, polite nod before returning to his book. Alina didn't think much of it at first. People cross paths every day without leaving an impact. But as minutes turned into an hour, she found herself noticing him again. Not in a curious or romantic way, but in the way someone notices calmness when their own life feels like a storm. When her phone buzzed with a reminder that it was time to head home, she sighed softly, bracing herself to return to reality. As she stepped outside, the rain greeted her with renewed intensity, forcing her to pause under the shelter. She glanced toward her car, calculating the dash she would need to make without waking Daniel. That was when he appeared beside her.
He didn't speak immediately, didn't intrude or demand attention. Instead, he simply stood there, holding his umbrella, his presence steady and unassuming. After a brief moment, he gently extended the umbrella toward her, offering to walk her to her car. Alina hesitated, not because she feared him, but because she wasn't used to kindness without expectation. It felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. But something in his quiet demeanor reassured her, and she nodded, accepting the gesture. They walked in silence, the sound of rain filling the space between them. When they reached her car, she quickly thanked him, hoping to end the interaction before it turned into something she wasn't ready to face. But as she opened the back door to check on Daniel, the man's gaze softened in a way she hadn't expected. There was no judgment, no surprise, just understanding. And that was what unsettled her the most. Before she could stop herself, the words slipped out, almost like a defense mechanism built over years of disappointment. She told him in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone that men don't like single moms. She expected the usual reaction, awkward silence, polite disagreement, or a quick exit. But his reaction shocked her. Instead of stepping back, instead of confirming her fears, he looked at her with a calm certainty that felt almost unfamiliar. His expression didn't change with pity or hesitation. If anything, there was a quiet strength in his eyes, as if her statement wasn't something he accepted as truth. In that moment, something shifted inside her, a small crack in the walls she had built so carefully around her heart. She didn't know it yet, but that brief encounter would begin to unravel everything she thought she knew about herself, about love, and about the possibility of being seen not as a burden, but as someone worthy of being chosen. And for the first time in a very long time, the rain didn't feel quite as heavy.
The next few days passed like any other, yet something felt different. Alina couldn't quite explain it, but the memory of that rainy evening lingered in her mind, quietly resurfacing during the most unexpected moments. It wasn't just the man himself, but the way he had looked at her, without hesitation, without judgment. It was a look she hadn't realized she had been craving for years. She tried to dismiss it as nothing more than a fleeting interaction, the kind that people forget as quickly as they happen. After all, life had taught her not to place too much importance on moments that felt too good to be true. But no matter how much she tried to push it aside, something about that encounter refused to fade. Her routine continued as usual. Early mornings, long shifts, and evenings spent caring for Daniel. Yet even in the midst of exhaustion, she found herself thinking differently. It was subtle at first, like questioning a belief she had accepted for too long. She began to wonder if perhaps her statement that night had been more about her own fears than about reality. Still, doubt held its ground. Experience had a way of reinforcing itself, and Alina's past had given her little reason to believe otherwise. She had seen how quickly people walked away when things became complicated, how easily love could turn into absence. Trust wasn't something she could rebuild overnight. A week later, she found herself returning to the same cafe. She told herself it was for the coffee, for the brief escape it offered from her routine. But deep down, she knew there was another reason she wasn't ready to admit. As she stepped inside, her eyes instinctively scanned the room, and there he was, sitting at the same corner table as if nothing had changed. For a moment, she considered leaving. It would have been easier to walk away, to avoid reopening something she wasn't sure she could handle. But instead, she stayed. She ordered her coffee and chose a seat near the window, telling herself it didn't matter whether he noticed her or not. But he did. This time, there was a small smile, one that carried a sense of familiarity. It wasn't overwhelming or intrusive. It was simple, genuine, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, it made her feel at ease. What followed wasn't dramatic or rushed. Their interactions remained quiet, almost cautious. They exchanged a few words, then a few more the next time.
His name was Samir, and unlike the people she had known before, he didn't ask questions that felt invasive or judgmental. He didn't try to define her or her situation. Instead, he listened, and that, more than anything, began to change something inside her. Samir had his own story, though he shared it in pieces, never overwhelming her with details. He spoke about life with a calm perspective, one that seemed shaped by both loss and growth. There was a depth to him that made his presence feel steady, like an anchor in a world that often felt unpredictable. Weeks turned into months, and their connection grew, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. He showed up again and again. Sometimes it was just a cup of coffee left waiting for her when she arrived. Other times it was a quiet conversation that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. But even as something beautiful began to take shape, Alina struggled. Fear didn't disappear just because hope appeared. If anything, it became more intense. The more she allowed herself to feel, the more she feared losing it. She questioned everything, his intentions, his patience, his willingness to stay when things became difficult. And then there was Daniel. Her son was her world, her priority above everything else. The idea of introducing someone into his life wasn't something she could take lightly. She had spent years building a safe, stable environment for him, and the thought of disrupting that stability terrified her. Samir never pressured her. He never asked to meet Daniel, never pushed for more than she was ready to give. Instead, he respected her boundaries in a way that made her trust him even more. But trust, for Alina, was still a fragile thing. One evening, as they sat in the cafe, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the weight of her fears finally surfaced. She didn't speak in long explanations or emotional confessions. Instead, she simply admitted that she was scared. Not of him, but of what he represented. The possibility of something real. Samir didn't try to fix her fears or dismiss them. He didn't offer empty reassurances or promises he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he acknowledged her feelings, accepting them without judgment. And in that moment, Alina realized something she hadn't understood before. Love wasn't about removing fear. It was about choosing to stay despite it. Still, the question remained, would she be able to take that step?
Time has a quiet way of revealing truths that words alone cannot. For Alina, it wasn't a single moment that changed everything, but a series of small, almost invisible shifts that slowly reshaped her understanding of herself and the world around her. The walls she had built over the years didn't come crashing down all at once. Instead, they softened, piece by piece, as she allowed herself to experience something she had long denied: hope. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind that would have once passed unnoticed. Daniel had fallen asleep early after a long day, his small hand still clutching the edge of his blanket, as if holding on to a dream. Alina stood by his bedside for a while, watching him breathe, feeling that familiar mix of love and responsibility that had defined her life for so long. But that night, there was something else, a quiet realization that she was no longer alone in carrying it all. Samir had not made grand promises or dramatic declarations. He hadn't tried to prove himself through exaggerated gestures. Instead, he had done something far more powerful. He had stayed. Through her doubts, her fears, her moments of withdrawal, he had remained steady, never demanding more than she was ready to give, yet never stepping away. And that consistency had begun to heal something deep within her. The turning point came when she finally allowed herself to take a step she had been avoiding for months. She introduced Samir to Daniel. It wasn't a perfect moment. There were no cinematic speeches or instant bonds. Daniel was shy at first, clinging to his mother, observing the unfamiliar presence with cautious curiosity. Alina's heart raced with every second, her mind filled with questions she couldn't silence. What if this was a mistake? What if she was putting her son at risk of another loss? But Samir didn't try to rush the moment. He didn't force interaction or try to win Daniel over with charm. Instead, he simply sat nearby, allowing the child to approach him at his own pace. He spoke gently, his tone calm and reassuring, creating a space that felt safe rather than overwhelming. And slowly, something beautiful unfolded. Daniel took a small step forward, then another. A question was asked, then another. Laughter followed, soft at first, then genuine. And in that simple exchange, Alina felt something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Relief. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because it felt real. Days turned into weeks, and the connection between them grew naturally. Samir became a quiet presence in their lives, not replacing anything, not forcing himself into a role, but simply being there. Whether it was helping Daniel with small tasks, sharing quiet moments, or supporting Alina in ways she hadn't realized she needed, his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. And one evening, as they sat together after putting Daniel to bed, Alina found herself returning to the words she had once spoken so firmly. Men don't like single moms. But now those words felt distant, almost unfamiliar, because the truth she had come to understand was far more profound. It wasn't about what men liked or didn't like. It was about finding someone who saw her not as a burden, but as a person, someone who didn't view her past as something to avoid, but as a part of her story that made her stronger. Samir hadn't just accepted her life, he had respected it, and that made all the difference. If this story has touched your heart so far, take a moment to like, comment, and share, because your support helps stories like this reach others who need to believe in hope again. As the days passed, Alina began to rediscover parts of herself she thought she had lost forever. She laughed more easily, smiled without forcing it, and allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by fear. But perhaps the most powerful moment came not in a grand scene, but in a quiet realization. She was no longer waiting for something to go wrong. She was finally allowing herself to believe that something could go right. Before we reach the ending, take a moment to comment, "Second chances are real," if you believe that love can find its way back, even after life breaks you. The rain returned one evening, much like the night they first met. But this time, everything felt different. As Alina stood by the window, watching the droplets trace their paths down the glass, she felt a sense of calm that had once seemed impossible. Samir stood beside her, not saying much, not needing to, because sometimes the strongest connections are felt in silence. She glanced at him, her heart no longer guarded, no longer questioning. And in that moment, she realized that the belief she once held so tightly had been shaped by pain, not truth. Men don't like single moms. No, the wrong people don't stay, but the right one does. And as she reached for his hand, not out of fear, but out of certainty, Alina understood something that would stay with her forever, that love doesn't come to erase your past. It comes to stand beside it, to accept it, and to build something new from it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The Emotional Stories, because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us that even the most broken hearts can find their way home. And as the rain continued to fall outside, it no longer felt like a storm. It felt like a beginning.